Murder attempt survivors, what happened?
While transferring work locations, I was staying with a cousin of mine at the new location. Her psychotic, alcoholic, drug-addled, vicious ex-boyfriend, whom she had just kicked out of her house, was stalking her. He saw me move in, assumed I was the new boyfriend, and lay in wait for me outside her house one night, where he jumped me from behind and slit my throat. Despite losing massive amounts of blood, I didn't die. I didn't even feel that bad. So while he was trying to break into her house, presumably to kill her too, I grabbed a baseball bat from the trunk of my car and beat him until I passed out. When I woke up, I wasn't thinking all that clearly, so I went inside, cleaned myself up, and drove the hospital. My cousin wasn't even home at the time. She had gone into the city with her mother for the weekend to see a show and go shopping. My attacker and I ended up in the same ICU. I had rendered him a quadriplegic. There was a great deal of civil and criminal legal bullshit to deal with, but in the end, I was cleared of any wrongdoing, and he was put on probation for 10 years. As he was no longer able to so much as brush his own teeth, his lawyer, provided by his wealthy family, convinced the judge DA that he was no longer a threat to anyone and the state would be spared the burden of providing him the round-the-clock care he needed if he wasn't sent to prison. I was left in massive debt, which took me many years to pay off. I did sue him for the injuries I sustained, but despite being a trust fund baby from a wealthy family, he himself was indigent. He'd blown his trust fund on drugs, booze, and gambling, and had nothing. His family provided him with everything, including his lawyer. He died about the same time his probation ended.
I was working from home one morning and heard a knock at the door at 8 a.m. I ignored it at first, hoping whoever it was would go away. After a minute of knocking, I opened the door. It was my neighbor who I had spoken with a few times. My wife was at work, and I could tell he was surprised when I opened the door and not my wife. He was expecting her to be home and not me. He noticed that I recently purchased a new car and asked if I could show it to him. He tried to walk inside, but I asked him to walk around to the garage because of COVID-19. I showed him the car, and he was acting strange. Always kept one hand in his pocket. My garage is very small, so we were in close proximity to each other. He kept inching closer to me, which made me uncomfortable. He brought an opened Coke bottle filled with a tan liquid and said, "I brought you a Coke." I declined the offer. After a few minutes, he asked if he could see my gauge cluster. We walked around to the driver's side, and I sat in the driver's seat to turn on the car and show him the gauge cluster. With door open, there was very little room besides the side of the car and the garage wall. After turning on the car, he pulled a large hunting knife to my neck. I immediately grabbed his wrist and slammed him back into the wall. At this point, we are wrestling between the car and wall as I try to get the knife away from him. During this 30-second period, it seems like an absolute miracle that I was not stabbed. The blade grazed past my stomach multiple times. I was eventually able to grab the knife and force him out into the driveway. Immediately after grabbing the knife, he started saying, "What are you doing?" "I was just trying to show you my knife," and acting like I had just assaulted him. I was in such a state of shock that I actually started to believe him and wondered if I had overreacted. I know this seems ridiculous, but I was completely delusional at the time and did not know what his intentions were. I stood in the driveway, hands shaking, with 911 dialed on my phone, but did not make the call. He acted like nothing just happened and started asking my questions. Really suspicious questions. "Do you have a security system?" I lied and said yes. I asked him to go home multiple times and eventually went back inside the house but did not shut the main garage door. At this point, I needed to drive into work and started getting ready. Showering, getting dressed, ECT. I assumed he had just walked back home. After getting ready, I went outside and walked around the house to the garage with a can of bear mace. I searched around the garage and was worried he was still there. As I started to get into my car and leave, I saw my neighbor laying down behind some boxes in the garage, staring at me. I yelled and ran as fast I could back to the front door and called the cops. Cops arrived quickly and my neighbor had disappeared. They searched around his house and mine but could not find him. They said they would stay in the area but were going to leave for now. My house is surrounded by woods and I have a large back porch. Frightened, I stood in the middle of the porch while holding bear mace. I looked around and noticed my neighbor hiding in the woods staring at me. I ran back inside and called the cops. Cops arrived quickly and pulled guns on my neighbor and arrested him. He later said, "I was just trying to scare him." They found the knife, zip ties, vodka, and a note on him that read, "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." It was later discovered that the Coke bottle he wanted me to drink contained pesticides. He was there to murder me or my wife. He was charged with 3 felony counts and is currently awaiting trial.
Not my story, but my cousin's. She was married to this crazy man. I won't go into detail about the ways he was awful, but he was insane. Also, before he married my cousin, he had another family who all died in a house fire. All 4 of his children and his previous wife. We all felt bad for him for suffering such a tragic loss, because we didn't know what he was like behind the scenes at home. We never suspected anything off about that, just thought it was a tragedy. Well, finally my cousin decided to leave him. She took her 2 kids and moved away. She had to leave abruptly, so she was missing a lot of important things. Social security cards, birth certificates, stuff like that. One day, after things cooled down some between her and her ex, she arranged for her to go over to their old house and gather the rest of their things. He asked that she bring the kids, because he missed them. Luckily, she decided to let them stay at their friend's house instead. She went over to the house, and he was absolutely enraged that she didn't bring the kids. He shot my cousin 4 times and then shot himself in the head. He was planning to do a murder-suicide with the whole family. That's why he wanted the kids there. My cousin was shot twice in the neck, in the face, and in the arm. Somehow, none of the bullets struck any major arteries or anything. She was able to make it next door to her neighbor's house and get help. She survived a murder-suicide attempt, and her ex didn't. That whole thing really makes me look at that house fire tragedy in a different light.
My heart dropped when I saw this question. I was 15, and my dad plotted to murder me. My dad had only been back around for a few months after being homeless for a while, due to his 20-plus-year meth addiction. He had never been violent towards me before, but I later found out he had tried to kill my mother just months prior, and she brushed it off as him having a PTSD episode. I came home from school. He surprise attacked me by suffocating me with a pillow, strangling, and attempted to sexually assault me. I had just gotten a boyfriend and wasn't around as often, and by the language he used when trying to assault me, it was clear this was the source of his anger. He had the TV turned up to an extreme volume so no one could hear me scream. I ended up being able to get up and run to the bathroom, the only room in our house with a lock. He grabbed the door, but I found a sharp object in the bathroom and told him to back up or I'd kill him. I somehow was able to shove the door shut and lock it. He tried to get in the bathroom but couldn't. He actually said, "I'm leaving," and closed the front door to try and lure me out. It was quiet for a while, but then I heard him breathing outside the door. He eventually left after a few hours, taking my money I had hidden in my bedroom, and called a relative telling them I'd been in a terrible accident and he needed a ride to the hospital. He ended up running when dropped off and was missing for a year. Most terrifying year of my life. His body was found by a fisherman at his favorite lake growing up. They found high levels of meth in his system, and it appeared to be a suicide. Later, when investigating the home I was attacked in, they found hammers, duct tape, knives under my mom's mattress, and looked like he very much so intended to kill me. Edit. Thank you everyone for the kind words. Certainly the craziest life experience I ever hoped to have, and therapy was a long journey. The craziest part of it all was that my dad from childhood was still there simultaneously with the horrid attacker. He cried outside the door for a while, telling me he was so sorry and I wouldn't ever see him again, but would switch to trying to lure me out and being aggressive. There were many moments I could hear the duality of who he was. The murderous, cracked-out, crazy person and someone who was regretful and really sad inside. IDK, just thought that was an interesting thing to add for context. It's not always just so cut and dry between a crazy bad person and a good normal person, I've learned.
My heart dropped when I saw this question. I was 15 and my dad plotted to murder me. My dad had only been back around for a few months after being homeless for a while due to his 20-plus year meth addiction. He had never been violent towards me before, but I later found out he had tried to kill my mother just months prior, and she brushed it off as him having a PTSD episode. I came home from school. He surprise attacked me by suffocating me with a pillow, strangling, and attempted to sexually assault me. I had just gotten a boyfriend and wasn't around as often, and by the language he used when trying to assault me, it was clear this was the source of his anger. He had the TV turned up to an extreme volume so no one could hear me scream. I ended up being able to get up and run to the bathroom, the only room in our house with a lock. He grabbed the door, but I found a sharp object in the bathroom and told him to back up or I'd kill him. I somehow was able to shove the door shut and lock it. He tried to get in the bathroom but couldn't. He actually said, "I'm leaving," and closed the front door to try and lure me out. It was quiet for a while, but then I heard him breathing outside the door. He eventually left after a few hours, taking my money I had hidden in my bedroom, and called a relative telling them I'd been in a terrible accident and he needed a ride to the hospital. He ended up running when dropped off and was missing for a year. Most terrifying year of my life. His body was found by a fisherman at his favorite lake growing up. They found high levels of meth in his system, and it appeared to be a suicide. Later, when investigating the home I was attacked in, they found hammers, duct tape, knives under my mom's mattress, and looked like he very much so intended to kill me. Edit. Thank you everyone for the kind words. Certainly the craziest life experience I ever hoped to have, and therapy was a long journey. The craziest part of it all was that my dad from childhood was still there simultaneously with the horrid attacker. He cried outside the door for a while, telling me he was so sorry and I would never see him again, but would switch to trying to lure me out and being aggressive. There were many moments I could hear the duality of who he was. The murderous, cracked-out crazy person, and someone who was regretful and really sad inside. IDK, just thought that was an interesting thing to add for context. It's not always just so cut and dry between a crazy bad person and a good normal person, I've learned.
I was in Thailand, heading back to my apartment from a popular corner of bars in Chiang Mai. I went down the same streets and alleys I always did, cutting through the center of the city to the edge of the moat by Ram Hospital. I passed by the technical college and saw a group of guys hanging on the corner. I didn't think anything of it as I entered the final alley that would put me at the moat and my apartment. Two mopeds passed me and went into an alcove to my right, and as I passed it, they zoomed out and cut me off. Four guys hopped off their bikes and one approached and said, "Where are you going?" and decked me in the face. As I think, did this motherfucker really just punch me in the face? I look up and he has his arm up and holding something in a swinging motion, and I did the only thing I could, put my arms up to protect my face and yell out. After several blows to my arm, I attempted to turn and run, but his buddies were there to stop me and kept cutting off my escape. After a couple minutes, could have been less. It's all a bit of a mess of memory. They all hopped on their bikes and dipped. I have no clue why. Maybe it was my yelling, and I looked down at my arm. My left arm, below the wrist, was cut halfway through, one of my bones completely exposed, marrow and everything, my hand hanging uselessly at the end. And I immediately knew I was in deep shit, even though I didn't feel a thing. I have minor medical training, so I took note that no arteries were severed, but I was bleeding profusely and needed help. I went to the guest house nearby and asked the attendant for help. Poor thing looked faint when she saw me low. She got me in her car and took me to Ram Hospital, literally 100 yards away. Turns out what they guys swung at me was a machete, according to the doctor. I thought it was a cane or rod of some sort. So that's my story. It's important for me to say I stayed in Thailand for a year after this event, despite friends' pleas for me to GTFO and come home. I wasn't about to let that shit ruin a lifetime opportunity for me. Anyway, I have full function of the arm and hand now, and after 4 years of drinking to bury the memory, I'm happy to say I started therapy 6 months ago. I quit drinking entirely, was diagnosed with PTSD, and am finally addressing the demon who's been hiding in the depths of my mind. and that motherfucker has his days numbered. Thanks for reading my story. It's one I just recently had the courage to tell in full, rather than passing it off as shit happens. Peace and love, Redditors. Edit, cleaned up the wording. Edit 2, cleaned up paragraphs 2.
I was 17 at the time. I was wicked sick one weekend, and my mother decided I needed to go to the hospital. She had been drinking all day, as she was a terrible alcoholic. It turned out that I had strep throat, so they're typing out my discharge paperwork, and my mother approached the desk where the nurse was sitting. Clearly stinking of alcohol, the nurse told my mother that she wouldn't be allowed to drive me home because she was clearly intoxicated. This sent my mother into a drunken rage, swearing and threatening the nurse, who told her if she left the police would be called. My mother grabbed me and hurries me into the car. I start yelling at her about how irresponsible she is and how she is ruining her life with alcohol. This pisses her off even more. We only live less than a mile away, but my mother has taken a different route than normal. When I ask why, she just says it's the long way and she doesn't want to get caught. As we're traveling down this dark main back road, she begins speeding like crazy. We were doing at least 90 miles per hour when she looks over at me with a blank face and says, "I'm sorry." She then pulled the e-brake and cut the wheel, sending us flying off the road. The next thing I remember is sitting in the front seat of a pickup truck with an EMT shining a flashlight in my eyes along who the president was. I responded that Bill Clinton was the president, 2000. Apparently, she had crashed us into a huge rock at the end of someone's property, directly on my side of the car. Apparently, I crawled over her and staggered to the door of the property to ask for help. They put us in different ambulance, and we headed back to the hospital we just left. Upon arrival, the nurse my mother fought with said, "I knew you'd be back." My mother, in a drunken, semi-conscious state, kept saying, "I'm sorry I tried to kill you. I love you," over and over. She suffered several broken ribs, a broken collarbone, broken nose, and cracked vertebrae. I had a concussion and some cuts on my face from the door window, basically exploding on impact with the rock. She was sentenced to some alcohol program through the courts and some community service. She suffered severe depression, and 6 months after this, she took her own life in another car accident. She actually asked me if I wanted to go for a ride with her that night, and I told her no. "I'll see you when you get home." That was the last thing I ever said to her.